Hi guys, welcome to another Winemaker Wednesday, changing up the location as well as the topic. So not so much sustainability today. We want to dive into a topic that there's been just a ton of discussion about lately, both here at the Lost Sierra Wine Company, but I know consumers are talking about it as well, and that is low alcohol. What does that mean? What does it mean for wines? What does it mean for our wines? How do we fit into that discussion? Because we absolutely do. So it's interesting to bring that to you today. Let's get to it. So the first thing we should probably do is talk about what low alcohol means and try and define it. So typical alcohol levels in wines range from 13 to 16% alcohol. European wines have been in the, down in the 11.5 to 12, 13% typically. And why is that? Well, it really has to do with where the grapes are grown. So if you think about more northern, cooler regions, i.e. Champagne, let's talk about Champagne way north in France. The reason that champagnes have lower alcohols typically, if you've ever looked at a bottle of champagne, it's 11 to 12% alcohol. It's cold in northern France. The days of sunshine, the hours of sunshine, the season is really compressed. The vines start growing the grapes later in the season and they shut down because it just gets cold at the end of the season. So what does that mean? It means you have less sugar produced and you have lower alcohol. The flip side of that is southern regions. As you get closer to the equator, you get longer days, more sunshine, more heat, and you get higher maturity in the grapes. Higher maturity, more sugar. More sugar, more alcohol. So let's define what low alcohol means. And in fact, there is no legal definition for it. The Tax Trade Bureau, the federal administration that regulates winemaking regulations, have not adopted a legal standard for it. So some organizations say that low alcohol is anything below 11%. That's their definition. Others say it's down as low as 5.5 to around 9.5%. Really low. There's no legal definition for it. So interesting side note, the CABC, or California Alcohol Beverage Control Agency, is the state agency that regulates alcohol and regulates winemaking within the state. They define a serving size of wine in two different ways. First is white wine. It's a 5-ounce pour of 12% alcohol. White wine, 5-ounce pour of 12% alcohol. A red wine is a 4-ounce pour of 15% alcohol wine. I don't know anybody that's drinking a 4 or 5-ounce pour of wine. So in a last effort to define what low alcohol means, let's go back to the TTD organization that I mentioned before. Now, while they don't actually define low alcohol, they do draw a line in the sand. At 7% alcohol and above, a wine bottle needs to carry the standard labeling requirements of vintage, variety, where it was bottled, the alcohol level, contained sulfites, government warning, all of those sorts of standard things that we would expect to see on a wine shelf. Below 7%, they require it to say wine, but beyond that, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration labeling requirements actually kick in, and there it needs to have ingredient, it needs to have nutritional, and it needs to have allergen labeling requirements on it. So again, they're not defining low alcohol, but they are drawing a line in the sand at 7% and above, standard wine labeling requirements. Below 7%, go talk to the US FDA. So you might wonder how low alcohol wines are actually produced. There's a couple different ways. The more natural way is to grow the grapes, harvest them at lower maturity, and you have less sugar. Because you have less sugar, you have lower alcohol. That's really straightforward and simple. The process of making a low alcohol wine is a bit rough on the wine. It's not a very natural process, it's a mechanical process, in fact. So you take a standard wine, 13, 14% alcohol wine, and you put it either through a distillation process, if you will, or a high pressure pump across a membrane. And in either situation, the end result is that you took a standard wine, you separated the alcohol from the water component, you use the alcohol for something else, and you take the water and you blend it back in, effectively lowering the alcohol in the wine. It's effective, it makes a low alcohol wine, but it does do something to the natural aspect of the wine. It's taking away. It's not just removing alcohol. There are other components. So there's something about it that I don't want to say denatures the wine, but it alters the wine in a material way. Let's leave it at that. At the Lost Sierra Wine Company, we like to say that our wines are lower in alcohol. Now, bit of semantics there. I'm saying lower, not necessarily low. They're not as low as we talked about previously in the 9, 10, or even 11% alcohol. Our wines are typically around 13% alcohol. So that's lower than most wines you'll find on the wine shelf, being in the 13.5 to 16% alcohol wines. Our wines are, again, right around 13. Why do we like them then? We really like wine. If you haven't figured that out yet. We enjoy wine. We like drinking wine. And as such, we like to enjoy our bottles of wines over a long meal with family and friends. If our wines have higher alcohol, 2 glasses in, that might be the end of the night for some people. If you're pushing 15, 16 alcohol, you have a couple of glasses of that and that's it. So I like to think about our wines as having a bit of a European sensibility to them relative to the alcohol. European wines, as we said previously, typically in the 12 to 13% alcohol, let's say, for a standard, red or white wine, not champagne, but 12 to 13% alcohol wines. The big difference, in my opinion, in an alcohol level of 12 to 13% versus drinking something that's 14 or 15 alcohol. You can have many more glasses, in my opinion, of a 13% alcohol wine over a period of a long meal with family and friends around the table than you can a 15% alcohol wine. Another reason that we like our wines to be around that 13%, alcohol can have a burning effect to the palate, to the sensation. So lower alcohol wines certainly don't have that effect at all. And as such, I think they pair better, they go better with a lot of the foods that we enjoy. You're not having the food's not having to overcome or compete with 14 or 15% alcohol. That 13% is kind of in a sweet spot right there where the food balances really well with the alcohol that's in the wine, or it's just not competing with it in any way. You don't have to focus on that. Focus on the acidity, the body of the wine, the fruit and the aromas. When you're trying to pair wines with food, you don't have to worry about the alcohol. Another element to our lower alcohol wines is that they tend to have more natural acid. Why is that? Well, because the wines are picked less mature, they have more acid. So less sugar, more acid is the equation there. The natural acid is bright, it's fresh, and invites you in for a second taste of the wine. Whereas if you have less acid, it tends to sit heavier, coat the palate. It can oftentimes, if you have really low acid, give you this soapy or flat characteristic to the palate, which can be interesting in some big heavy wines, but in lower alcohol wines, you need to find that balance, and more acid with lower alcohol works really well to make it an inviting, fresh, bright tasting experience. And the last point about low alcohol wines that we love is the freshness and the brightness of the fruit, flavors and aromas. So think about walking through a field of strawberries and you pick a perfectly ripe strawberry. It's firm and you taste it and it just explodes with the most fresh strawberry you've ever had. Think of walking through an orchard and there's green apples or red apples and you pick one off, it just comes off in your hand just perfectly. You bite into it and it's intensely green apple. Peaches, plums, nectarines, a perfectly ripe plum, that red cherry fruit that comes through in it. It's not pruny, it's not mealy, it's not soft. It's bright, it's got a bunch of acid in it that we just talked about. It's an amazing plum flavor. It actually tastes like plum. It's amazing. Take all of those things and cram them into a bottle of wine. That's what our lower alcohol wines tend to have. You don't get that when you harvest grapes really ripe. That fruit turns into something else. Those fruit characteristics turn into other characteristics, which can be really fun and pleasing. But the lower alcohol wines tend to have this freshness to fruit that you just don't find in high alcohol wines. So That's another reason why we like our wines right around that 13%, plus or minus. There's no magic number, but right around there. You get the freshness of acidity and that freshness of fruit that you just don't find in higher alcohol wine. Sort of the last thing I'll say about our low alcohol wines is, from a winemaking perspective, I actually think they're a little bit easier or less risky to make. There's some benefits as well. So first off, having less sugar means that the yeast don't have to work as hard to ferment a big quantity of sugar to make the alcohol. They tend to move right through the fermentations pretty readily. By comparison, in a high alcohol wine, lots of sugar, the yeast have to work for a longer period of time, and the higher the alcohol is more toxic to the yeast, so they can start to die off, and you can get what's called a stuck fermentation, meaning that the yeast are dead and there's still sugar left in the wine. That's a super risky situation. All sorts of spoilage, yeast and bacteria can come in and try and consume that sugar, so you're having to deal with that situation. Low alcohol wines, like it's not as big a concern. The other aspect that I think makes making these kinds of wines a little bit easier is you have more natural acid. Acids tend to be a little bit higher than in high alcohol wines. We talked about that before. As such, again, we can add fewer sulfites to these wines. Why is that? Because there's more acid in them, the sulfite that we add has more effect at higher acid levels than they do at lower acid levels. So high alcohol wines have lower acid levels. It takes more sulfites added to have the same effect. Lower alcohols, higher acids, fewer sulfites added to these wines. Well, there you have it. We've covered a lot. Shared with you why we like our wines kind of in that sweet spot of 13% alcohol, that freshness, that brightness that comes through, the fewer sulfites. I think that's a really big deal. So hopefully you've learned a few things. If you have any questions or comments, I know I touched on a few areas that may be a little less clear, or I could have been a little more clear. Put your questions and comments in the comment section below. We'll get to all of those. Be sure to hit like, subscribe. See you in the next video.